What if the shy, awkward teenager who spent his nights coding alone in his bedroom instead of going to parties would one day build something used by nearly 1/3 of the entire human population? What if the college student mocked as a socially clumsy nerd, sued by his own classmates, betrayed by people he trusted, and dismissed by seasoned investors as too young and too inexperienced to lead a real company, would one day become one of the most powerful and wealthiest individuals in modern history? This is not a fantasy. This is the real story of Mark Zuckerberg, a story that did not begin with fame or certainty, but with isolation, obsession, betrayal, public humiliation, and an unshakable belief in an idea that almost nobody else understood at the time. Before the world knew the name Facebook, before billions of people carried his creation in their pockets every single day, there was simply a quiet, intensely focused boy in Dobbs Ferry, New York, who found more comfort inside lines of computer code than inside normal childhood friendships. Mark was born in 1984 to a father who worked as a dentist and a mother who worked as a psychiatrist, before dedicating herself to raising the family in a household that valued intellect, discipline, and curiosity above almost everything else. At just 12 years old, long before most children even understood what a computer program was, Mark taught himself to code and built a rudimentary messaging system for his family's home computers, which he called ZuckNet, allowing his father's dental office and their household computers to communicate with simple pop-up messages. It was a small invention, but it revealed something enormous about his mind: an ability to look at ordinary communication problems and quietly build tools to solve them, years before the rest of the world even recognized those problems existed. Socially, however, things were far more difficult. Mark was often described by peers as intensely awkward, blunt to the point of seeming cold, and far more comfortable discussing ideas and logic than engaging in casual, small talk or emotional conversation. The social awkwardness followed him through his teenage years, even as his technical talent grew at a startling pace. He attended Phillips Exeter Academy, an elite boarding school, where he continued building software projects, including an early version of a music recommendation program that caught the attention of major tech companies like Microsoft and AOL, both of which reportedly offered to buy the software and hire him directly out of high school. He turned them down, choosing instead to attend Harvard University, driven by a restless need to keep building rather than to cash out. Early on, a smaller success at Harvard, his awkwardness and impulsiveness led to one of the most damaging moments of his young life. In 2003, frustrated and reportedly emotionally distressed after a personal disappointment, Mark built a website called FaceMash late one night, which pulled photos of female students without their permission and let visitors rate their attractiveness against each other. The site spread across campus within hours, but it also triggered outrage, formal disciplinary action from Harvard's administration, and accusations of violating student privacy and campus policy. He was nearly expelled, forced to issue a public apology, and left carrying a reputation as reckless and socially careless, a label that would follow him into his next and far more consequential project. Rather than retreating from technology after that humiliation, Mark doubled down, and in February 2004, working from his Harvard dorm room alongside roommates, including Dustin Moskovitz and Eduardo Saverin, he launched a website called TheFacebook. Designed initially as a simple way for Harvard students to connect and view each other's profiles online, it spread with astonishing speed, first across Harvard, then to other Ivy League schools, then to colleges across the entire country, revealing an appetite for online social connection that no one, including Mark himself, had fully anticipated. But almost immediately, controversy followed him again, as twin brothers Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss, along with business partner Divya Narendra, accused Mark of stealing their idea for a similar social networking site called Harvard Connection, which they claimed he had agreed to help build, before quietly launching his own competing platform instead. This accusation would eventually turn into a lengthy and highly public legal battle, one that dragged Mark's reputation through years of lawsuits, depositions, and media scrutiny, ultimately resulting in a settlement with the Winklevoss twins, reportedly worth around $65 million in cash and stock, though disputes and appeals continued for years afterward. At the very same time, tension was building inside Mark's own founding team. Eduardo Saverin, an early co-founder who had provided crucial initial funding, found his ownership stake in the company sharply diluted after Mark restructured the business, while Eduardo remained back on the East Coast pursuing an internship, a decision that led to bitter accusations of betrayal and eventually another lawsuit. Dramatized years later in the film The Social Network, Mark has never fully addressed every detail of that conflict publicly, but the episode left him with a lasting reputation, at least in the public eye, as someone willing to make cold, calculated decisions, even at the cost of personal relationships, a reputation that shaped public perception of him for years to come. Despite these personal and legal storms, Mark made a decision that stunned his family and professors alike, dropping out of Harvard entirely to move to Palo Alto, California, and dedicate himself completely to building what was now simply called Facebook. This was not a comfortable, well-funded beginning. The earliest team worked out of a small rented house, running the company with minimal staff, minimal structure, and constant uncertainty about whether the platform could ever generate real, sustainable revenue. Early investors and outside observers frequently questioned whether a free social network with no clear business model could survive long-term, and Mark faced constant pressure, including multiple acquisition offers from larger companies such as Yahoo, which reportedly offered around $1 billion to buy Facebook outright in 2006, an offer that many close to Mark urged him to accept immediately. Turning down that offer was an enormous, nerve-wracking gamble, one that could have ended in total failure if user growth had slowed or advertising revenue had never materialized. Instead, Mark trusted his long-term vision over short-term financial safety, a decision that revealed one of the defining traits of his entire career: the willingness to sacrifice guaranteed comfort for uncertain, but larger long-term potential. The years that followed were filled with relentless technical and business challenges. Facebook had to constantly rebuild its infrastructure to handle explosive user growth, faced serious early struggles figuring out how to monetize the platform effectively, and dealt with repeated privacy controversies as new features like Newsfeed, launched in 2006, initially triggered major user backlash, with many users feeling their personal information was suddenly being displayed too publicly, forcing Mark to issue public apologies and quickly adjust privacy controls. Then came arguably the most dangerous period in the company's history: the shift from desktop computers to mobile phones in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Facebook's core platform had been built primarily for web browsers, and as smartphones exploded in popularity, the company found itself dangerously behind, with early mobile experiences performing poorly and threatening to make the entire platform irrelevant in a rapidly changing technological landscape. This crisis became painfully public when Facebook went public on the stock market in May 2012, and its stock price collapsed by more than 50% within just a few months, driven largely by investor fear that Facebook had no credible strategy for the mobile future. Analysts openly questioned whether Mark, still in his 20s at the time, had the experience and strategic maturity to lead an aging plan and prevent Facebook from becoming another outdated internet fad. Rather than panicking or stepping aside, Mark made an aggressive internal decision to essentially rebuild the entire company around a mobile-first philosophy, restructuring engineering priorities, redesigning the core app, and pushing the company to treat mobile not as an afterthought, but as the primary product itself. This turnaround required enormous internal sacrifice, long stretches of engineering overtime, and a willingness to admit that the company's original desktop-focused foundation needed to be fundamentally rethought rather than simply patched. Over the following years, that bet paid off dramatically, as Facebook's mobile advertising business grew into the primary engine driving the company's revenue, eventually helping the stock not only recover, but climbed to levels far beyond its original public offering price. Alongside this internal transformation, Mark also pursued a series of major acquisitions that would reshape the company's future, including the 2012 purchase of Instagram for approximately $1 billion, a deal many critics mocked at the time as wildly overpriced for a photo-sharing app with a small team, and the 2014 acquisition of WhatsApp for a staggering $19 billion, another deal widely questioned by outside analysts. Both acquisitions later proved to be enormously valuable, transforming into some of the most widely used communication platforms on the planet and reinforcing Mark's willingness to make bold, heavily criticized bets based on long-term conviction rather than short-term public opinion. Yet even as the company grew into a global giant, new and far more serious challenges emerged, no longer about growth or mobile strategy, but about trust, ethics, and responsibility. In 2018, revelations broke that a political consulting firm called Cambridge Analytica had improperly accessed personal data from millions of Facebook users without proper consent, using that information for political targeting during major elections. The scandal triggered a massive global backlash. Congressional hearings in the United States, where Mark was personally questioned for hours by lawmakers, a significant public relations crisis, a steep temporary stock decline, and a wave of public distrust toward Facebook and toward Mark personally, with many accusing him of prioritizing growth and profit over user privacy and platform responsibility for years leading up to that point. This period forced Mark into some of the most difficult public accountability moments of his career, requiring him to testify before government committees, publicly apologize multiple times, and lead sweeping internal changes to how the company handled user data, advertising transparency, and content moderation, changes that were costly, complex, and still debated by critics as either insufficient or overly restrictive depending on who was asked. Rather than retreating from responsibility, Mark continued pushing the company through additional controversies, including ongoing debates over misinformation on the platform, questions about the platform's impact on mental health, particularly among younger users, and intense scrutiny over content moderation decisions during politically sensitive periods around the world. In 2021, in the middle of continued criticism, Mark made another dramatic and heavily scrutinized decision, rebranding the parent company from Facebook to Meta and pivoting enormous company resources toward building what he described as the metaverse, an ambitious and largely unproven vision of immersive, virtual, and augmented reality environments meant to reshape how people work, socialize, and spend time online. This pivot was met with significant skepticism from investors and the public, with the company's stock experiencing steep declines as billions of dollars were poured into virtual reality research and hardware development with uncertain near-term payoff, once again raising public questions about whether Mark's long-term vision would prove correct or whether this would become his most costly miscalculation. True to the pattern that has defined his entire career, Mark did not abandon the vision under pressure, choosing instead to adjust strategy, cut costs in other areas of the company, and continue investing heavily in both virtual reality and, increasingly, artificial intelligence research, positioning Meta as a serious competitor in the rapidly evolving AI landscape, alongside companies like OpenAI and Google. What makes this story genuinely valuable, beyond simply being impressive, are the deeper lessons buried inside the struggle. The first lesson is that early social awkwardness or personal mistakes, even deeply embarrassing ones like the FaceMash controversy, do not have to permanently define a person's future, provided they are willing to learn, take accountability, and channel that same intensity toward something more constructive. The second lesson is that betrayal and conflict, even with close friends or business partners, are sometimes an unavoidable part of building something ambitious. And how a person handles those conflicts, whether through legal resolution, public accountability, or quiet reflection, matters far more than pretending such conflicts never happen. The third lesson is that turning down guaranteed financial comfort, such as Mark rejecting Yahoo's billion-dollar acquisition offer, requires enormous conviction and carries real risk. But sometimes protecting a long-term vision against short-term security is exactly what separates a passing trend from something that reshapes an entire industry. The fourth lesson is that even massive, well-established companies can find themselves dangerously behind due to shifting technology, as seen in Facebook's mobile crisis, and survival often depends on a leader's willingness to admit the original plan is outdated and rebuild core priorities, rather than defending past decisions out of pride. The fifth lesson is that with enormous influence comes enormous responsibility, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal serves as a sobering reminder that growth and profit can never be allowed to fully outweigh ethical responsibility toward the very users who make a platform's success possible in the first place. The sixth lesson is that public criticism and steep financial setbacks, like the harsh reaction to the Meta rebrand, do not automatically mean a long-term vision is wrong, but they do demand constant, honest reevaluation, humility, and willingness to adjust course based on real evidence rather than stubborn pride. Mark Zuckerberg's journey is not a simple, comfortable story of an easy rise to power. It is the story of a socially awkward teenager who found belonging inside computer code, a young man who nearly derailed his own future through a reckless late-night decision at Harvard, an entrepreneur who was sued by former friends and former classmates, while still in his early 20s, a young CEO who turned down a billion-dollar offer against enormous pressure, and a leader who watched his company's stock collapse by more than half in public view before rebuilding the entire business around a technology shift almost nobody inside the company had fully prepared for. It is a story built on formal disciplinary hearings, on painful lawsuits with people who once called him a friend, on congressional testimony under intense public scrutiny, and on billions of dollars poured into an uncertain future vision that critics openly mocked before it had any chance to prove itself. And yet, from all of that struggle came a platform that connected billions of strangers across every continent, technology acquisitions that reshaped global communication, and a level of influence that reminds us all of a simple, powerful truth, that meaningful success is very rarely a straight, comfortable line, and that the people who reshape entire industries are rarely the ones who avoid controversy and criticism entirely, but the ones who keep refining their vision, keep taking responsibility for their mistakes, and keep building forward long after the public has already written them off as reckless, naive, or simply wrong. If there is one final thought to carry forward from this story, it is this: your most embarrassing mistake or your most painful betrayal does not have to be the end of your story. It might simply be the uncomfortable chapter that teaches you exactly what you need to learn before you build something far greater than you ever imagined possible.